Hi everybody, thanks so much for checking out my channel, and thanks especially for checking out this video. The Testimonium Flavianum is about 100 words long, but this short passage has been a treasure trove of ancient information about the historical Jesus through the lens of a historian with no allegiance to any Christian doctrine. But a shocking new book is now making the argument that centuries of scholarly opinion about this short passage are all dead wrong. Stunningly, this book is freely available online, funded by an anonymous donor who wanted the argument to reach as many people as possible. But it's not a work of Christian apologetics. It's a reputable academic work by one of the most rigorous scholarly publishing companies, and it's changing what we know about one of the most important, most widely scrutinized historians from antiquity. Here's the key question that we're going to ask. Should we rethink what we know about the historical Jesus? The scholarly and academic perspective on the historical Jesus is rapidly shifting, and I'm going to review one of the landmark works that's at the center of that shift. So here's the book, and it's by author T.C. Schmidt. And I recently read this book, and when I did, it really blew my mind. So the new book was published by Oxford University Press in 2025, and that's one of the most rigorous, most scrupulous academic publishers. And it's also been endorsed by a lot of these figures who are on the screen now, who are major thinkers in the field of biblical scholarship. Now, this isn't an evangelical lineup. These are mainstream prestigious scholars, and the endorsements that this book has received reflect serious academic engagement. And the publishing of this book is perhaps fascinating in and of itself. The full text by Dr. Schmidt is freely available at josephusandjesus.com. That combination of Oxford publication, open access funding, and endorsements from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton tells you how significant the field believes this to be. Now, let's talk a little bit about Josephus first. So Josephus was born in Jerusalem in the 30s, and he was born to a very prestigious family in Judea. He trained as a priest, he became a Pharisee at the age of 19, a diplomat at the age of 26, and he was appointed general of Galilee at the age of 30. He grew up in Jerusalem just years after Jesus was crucified there, and he lived in Galilee, where Jesus had his home base. Now, after the Jewish war with Rome ended around 70 CE, Josephus came under Roman patronage and he left Judea. He spent the next 25 years in Rome writing his historical works in the last decade of the first century. But here's what's critical. When Josephus writes about Judea, he's writing about his own experiences in the 50s and 60s, less than 3 decades after the death of Jesus. And he's writing not just as a Jew and a priestly member of the Sanhedrin, but also as military governor of Galilee, where Jesus built his ministry. And Josephus was shrewd in navigating elite social circles. His relationships with Ananus II, members of the Herodian dynasty, and leaders of the Sanhedrin were all forged in Jerusalem and Galilee in the 50s and 60s within a single generation of the crucifixion. And in the 90s, Josephus wrote The Antiquities of the Jews, a monumental work which included the 100-word Testimonium Flavianum, which was the testimony of Flavius Josephus. Nearly 2,000 years later, these 100 words from Josephus are some of the most fascinating ever written by any historian. Now, the reason why I'm going over some of these details is because the information pipeline was much closer to the events than the publication date alone would suggest. Now, before getting into too many of the manuscript details, it's worth establishing what Dr. Schmidt's authenticated TF contributes historically, regardless of where you land on theological questions. First, the TF is not a distant echo. It's a socially proximate testimony. Anyone arguing for mythicism or wholesale legendary invention has to reconcile themselves with the fact that this is a nuanced, ambiguous, first-hand connected account written by a man who personally knew people directly connected to the trial of Jesus. Second, the complexities of Josephus's personal relationships with members of the Sanhedrin help explain why he wasn't more hostile towards Jesus. In other words, Schmidt's work shows a fascinating pattern. Josephus was betrayed by 2 very important individuals, Ananus II and Simon, son of Gamaliel. These were people from the 2 families who were responsible for the death of Jesus and later James. And Dr. Schmidt argues explicitly that this personal history shaped the tone of the TF. And in this video, I'm going to show you why the ambiguity of the TF itself isn't suspicious and is instead historically intelligible. Third, there are several important insights about early Christianity that shine through the TF even on a skeptical reading. First, Jesus was a doer of paradoxa, which are startling or surprising deeds. We don't get more details, but these could have been sorcery or miracles, but Josephus does seem to call the works of Jesus genuinely startling or at least unnatural. Second, Jesus was venerated and sanctified by a community early enough for Josephus to document it as a live public reality within the first generation. Third, the reason for Jesus' execution was largely theological, driven by Jewish religious leadership characterizing him as someone who led people astray. It wasn't primarily a Roman political calculation. Fourth, In neutral terms, Josephus does leave us with the impression that Jesus' followers believed that he appeared to them after his death. These are all critical elements of the birth of Christianity, and they're served up by someone who wasn't just a historian living in Rome. He was a member of all of the social circles where the impacts of these events were felt. Now, here's the big objection to the authenticity of the TF. In its current Greek form, it says, Jesus, who was the Christ. Now, why would a first-century Pharisee Jew turned esteemed advisor to the Roman imperial court say that Jesus was the Christ? This is the key dispute. Now, Schmidt makes the argument that the TF is almost completely authentic except for one word, and we'll get into the Greek, but the key difference is whether Josephus writes, who was the Christ, or as Schmidt contends, Jesus, who was called the Christ. If you accept this analysis by Dr. Schmidt, then much of the rest of Josephus's writings about Jesus fall into place. Now, let's first focus on the linguistic phrasing of Jesus was the Christ. So Dr. Schmidt examines manuscript traditions in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Arabic, and Armenian. The current TF is rendered with this phrase, which means he was the Christ. Now, this sounds like a Christian confession. Jerome's Latin independently renders it, however, with this phrase, which means believed to be the Christ, and that work is from 393 CE. A Syriac translation traceable to Jacob of Edessa, one of the most learned translators of the 8th century, renders this instead with this phrase, which means thought to be the Christ. So we have two independent translators. They were working centuries apart, and they were working from Greek texts that we no longer have, and both of these individuals converge on the same non-confessional reading. And by the way, these are two of the oldest versions of the TF that we actually have. When you restore the thought to be reading, the passage sounds much more like a skeptical historian summarizing a controversial movement, not a Christian creed. Now, Dr. Schmidt also notes that the phrase, he was the Christ, is strange even as a Christian insertion because it says was and not is. No Christian writing an apologetic forgery would make Josephus speak of Jesus in the past tense as if he were simply gone. This reading is also consistent with how Josephus uses the language elsewhere. Later, in Antiquities 20, Josephus refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ, using this phraseology. The most plausible explanation is that a word like this accidentally fell out of the Greek tradition, leaving the awkward was the Christ behind. It's a single word, and it's easy to imagine how it might have gone missing in some translations. Now let's talk about the fact that centuries of Christian writers also ignored the TF. Again, the argument is whether Christians put words in Josephus's mouth in later transcriptions of the Testimonium Flavianum. But here's the argument that stopped me cold when I read Schmidt's book. If Christians invented or heavily altered the TF to make it pro-Christian, you would expect early Christian writers to trumpet it constantly as their best non-Christian evidence of Jesus. But the opposite actually happened. Schmidt surveys 20 instances of the TF being quoted or paraphrased across centuries of Greek Christian literature, and he finds that the overwhelming majority treated it as neutral, mundane, or unfavorable towards Jesus. So writer after writer across multiple centuries and geographic regions quotes the TF and then ignores its allegedly spectacular claims entirely, instead noting only unremarkable details. And many early Christians actually felt that the TF was a negative portrayal of Jesus. As Dr. Schmidt explains, a forger writing a pro-Christian passage wouldn't have produced something that left centuries of Christian apologists confused or worried about how to use it. For centuries, Christian apologists essentially ignored Josephus's writings. That's not something they would have done if they put words in Josephus's mouth explaining that Jesus was the Christ. Now, the TF also contains language that a Christian forger probably would not have chosen. Dr. Schmidt identifies several phrases in the TF that are either ambiguous or potentially negative, and these have survived intact into our manuscripts. For instance, this phrase, a certain Jesus, carries a slightly dismissive or distancing tone in Greek. According to the Standard Greek Lexicon of Liddell Scott Jones, this indefinite adjective can carry a sense of contempt when used with proper names. A Christian forger would not have written things this way. Now, this word means paradoxa, or startling deeds or paranormal acts. It carries the connotation of sorcery in ancient non-Christian literature. Celsus uses this exact word to accuse Jesus of practicing magic, and Josephus himself uses it to describe the magicians of Pharaoh in their duel with Moses. Now, the next word, which I'm showing here on the screen, really means led astray, and this is used to describe Jesus drawing followers, and this can also carry a negative or deceptive connotation. In Greek, Cassiodorus, translating Josephus elsewhere, renders this same word as feigning or pretending. And the closing phrase uses this word, which means tribe or clan. Now, this is a slightly distancing or dismissive term for the Christians. Early Christians never referred to themselves this way. This phrase carries hints that the author was disappointed that the movement persisted. Now, none of these phrases would appear in a Christian fabrication. They survived because Josephus probably wrote them. Schmidt's argument is that Josephus wrote the entire TF in a deliberately ambiguous or slightly negative way, but it definitely wasn't obviously positive. Now, I want to talk about the parallel with another figure described in Josephus's work. This is one of the most striking findings in the book, and most people discussing this topic haven't fully absorbed this argument yet. Just a few chapters before TF, Josephus describes a man who pretended to be Alexander, son of Herod. Josephus writes that this impostor used, again, this technique, which means led astray, on certain men because they received his words with pleasure, and he uses this word for pleasure, and this is presented as evidence of their gullibility. Now, the TF uses almost identical vocabulary to describe Jesus. Again, Josephus uses this word, which means led astray, on men who received truisms with pleasure. There are unmistakable similarities in the way that Josephus describes Jesus leading his followers astray and Alexander fooling his believers. So here are some of the same unusual words which appear in both passages, just chapters apart from each other. Now, this parallel is too precise to be coincidental and points again to the fact that Josephus was likely the author of the TF. In the false Alexander passage, these words carry a skeptical or negative connotation, suggesting Josephus may have intended the same nuance when he was writing about Jesus. Now, there's an important convergence here between Josephus, the Talmud, and the Toledot Yeshu. The convergence across all hostile sources is really one of the most underappreciated arguments in this space, and Dr. Schmidt's analysis makes it visible. The Babylonian Talmud accuses Jesus of inciting all Israel and leading them astray. This is in Sanhedrin 43a. The Toledot Yeshu, an ancient hostile Jewish account of the life of Jesus, similarly says that Jesus misled the world by his sorcery. Celsus, again writing in the early 2nd century, says also that Jesus was a deceiver, using very similar terms. Jewish leaders in the gospel say similar things, that Jesus stirred up the people. And now we have the TF, which, when read carefully through Dr. Schmidt's analysis, uses this same word in a way that strongly implies that Jesus led or essentially misled people who were overly gullible in receiving his teachings. So this is three independent, antagonistic Jewish sources, Josephus, the Talmud, and the Toledot Yeshu, which all converge on the same characterization of Jesus without any of them appearing to directly copy each other. This kind of cross-source convergence on an unflattering detail is exactly what historians look for when assessing authentic tradition. Now, one of the reasons why Dr. Schmidt's analysis is so important is because it does directly refute the argument that Jesus was a political rather than a theological threat. So there is a strong tendency in modern critical scholarship to frame Jesus primarily as a political problem for Rome rather than a theological threat to Judaism. It's a contention that's been advanced by Bart Ehrman and many others, and it contextualizes the killing of Jesus as a political move. Now, on this reading, Jewish authorities were essentially bystanders, and Rome did the real work of killing Jesus for seditious activity. But again, the hostile source record tells a very different story. Josephus aligns with Jewish sources that claim that Jesus was a theological affront to Judaism. And as Schmidt shows through the use of this phrase, Josephus claims direct social proximity to the very people who accused Jesus, making this not a distant theological commentary, but a first-hand social observation. So the Rome did it framing becomes very difficult to sustain when three independent Jewish sources across centuries converge on the same characterization of Jesus as a theological pretender. Now, let's talk a little bit about the stylometric evidence. Dr. Schmidt runs a statistical analysis of the vocabulary in the TF, and he weighs it against Josephus's entire corpus of over 400,000 words. Both common and rare words appear in the TF at precisely the frequency you would expect if Josephus was the author. Even the three lexemes that appear rarely or uniquely in the TF for Christianos or Christian are exactly what you would expect, given that these are rare words in the 1st century Greek in general. Now, there are also multiple other scholars who actually began skeptical of the TF, and their perspectives on the authenticity changed after they conducted a quantitative stylistic analysis. Those individuals include figures like Henry Thackeray and David Mieland. Now, let's talk a little bit about the narrative integration argument. The TF appears exactly where you would expect it in Josephus's chronological account of events under Pontius Pilate. It's in a sequence of disturbances and controversial figures. A Christian scribe inserting a forgery would have needed to do so with remarkable narrative precision. Josephus, writing it himself, requires no such explanation. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the Among Us discovery. This is the most original finding in the book, and most people discussing this topic have not fully absorbed it yet. Dr. Schmidt describes how he was finishing the conclusion of the book, and he reread the TF one more time, and he noticed for the first time a phrase that he had probably passed over hundreds of times. The TF says that Jesus was condemned at the accusation of the first men among us, again using this phrase in Greek. Now, Schmidt examines all 51 other uses of this phrase in Josephus, and he found a consistent pattern. It always signals direct personal familiarity, not generic reference to Jews in general. So Josephus appears to be claiming that he actually knew some of the people who had accused Jesus. Now, there are actually two individuals whose relationship with both Jesus and Josephus are essential to understanding why the TF reads the way it does. Schmidt crystallizes these connections using Josephus' own words in a way that no previous scholar has ever done. These two individuals are Ananus II and Simon, son of Gamaliel. This may sound like an aside, but I promise I'm going to show you why this is such an important set of details. Let's start with their connection to Jesus. So Dr. Schmidt argues that both Ananus II and Simon, son of Gamaliel, were almost certainly present at the trial of Jesus, and he makes this case on two independent grounds. First, the Jewish Passover law required faithful Jews to be in Jerusalem, in their father's house, on the night of the Passover. Jesus was arrested on the night of Passover, and he was brought first to the house of Ananus, the father of Ananus II. Ananus II would have certainly been there that night by religious obligation. The same logic applies to Simon, son of Gamaliel, whose father, Gamaliel, as we will see, was almost certainly at the trial as well. Second, the Mishnah, the foundational document of rabbinical Judaism, specifies that when trying a false prophet, the entire Sanhedrin body was required to be present. Jesus was explicitly accused of false prophecy, which means Jewish law required every member of the Sanhedrin to attend. Now, if you've read the Gospel of John, you'll recognize the name Annas. Annas is the Greek rendering of Ananus I, who was the father of Ananus II. According to John's Gospel, Ananus I was the first person to interrogate Jesus after his arrest. His son-in-law was Caiaphas, who was the high priest, and he formally presided over the trial and condemned Jesus. Ananus II was therefore the son of the man who first interrogated Jesus and the brother-in-law of the man who condemned him. He was almost certainly in his father's house that night and almost certainly present at the full Sanhedrin trial. Now, let's look at Gamaliel. The Gospels and the book of Acts describe Gamaliel as the most eminent Pharisee and Sanhedrin leader of his era. Acts 22 tells us that the Apostle Paul actually studied under Gamaliel. Acts 5 places Gamaliel at the Sanhedrin trial of the apostles shortly after the crucifixion, where Peter accuses the Sanhedrin of murdering Jesus. And Gamaliel is in that passage named as present and responding. Again, the full Sanhedrin was required to attend the trial of a false prophet, and Gamaliel, as its leader, would unquestionably have been there. His son, Simon, son of Gamaliel, was very likely present as well, either as a member of the Sanhedrin or as one of the students, whom the Mishnah says had reserved seats at such proceedings. So Schmidt's chronological analysis places Simon's birth before 10 CE, making him an adult by the time of the crucifixion in 30 to 33 CE. Now we're going to address the relationship between Josephus on the one hand and Ananus II and Simon ben Gamaliel on the other. All right, Ananus II was Josephus's direct military commander during the Jewish War. Josephus was a young, rising talent appointed as general and governor of Galilee. But Simon, son of Gamaliel, who was by then the head of the Sanhedrin, was a political operator, and he decided that Josephus needed to be removed. He secretly bribed Ananus II to issue orders stripping Josephus of his command. Josephus actually only found out about this because someone was at the meeting between Ananus II and Simon, son of Gamaliel, and he secretly tipped off Josephus. So Josephus managed to survive the political assault, but the betrayal was real, and it's also documented in his own biography. So Dr. Schmidt makes the following inference explicitly in interviews about the book. He states, Josephus is betrayed by his commander, he's betrayed by Simon, and both of these men descend from families that had Jesus put to death. So you can understand why he might be a little more tolerant of Jesus and Jesus' followers. This is not speculation, it's a historically grounded inference from Josephus' own documented relationships and grievances. And this brings us back to the question of why the TF reads the way it does. Josephus' account of Jesus is probably mildly negative, particularly based on Dr. Schmidt's rendering. But compare it with other Jewish sources which describe Jesus. The Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Gittin 57a describes Jesus as being submerged in boiling excrement for all eternity. Josephus is strikingly muted by comparison. Schmidt's argument is that this muted tone is historically intelligible. The two men whose families killed Jesus and one of whom executed James and other Christians also betrayed Josephus personally. So you can understand why a man of Josephus's temperament might not write about Jesus with the same venom as sources that had no such complicated personal history with the families responsible. Josephus was a Jew, but his tolerance of and loyalty to Sanhedrin politics was in his rearview mirror. He had at this point navigated his way into being a recognized authority by the Roman imperial court. Now again, I want to underscore this point because I think it's a pretty important one. All of this politics, you get nothing else out of it, shows that the TF is not a distant echo. It's a socially proximate testimony shaped by a man who knew the people involved and who was part of all the communities where these effects were most acutely felt. And these are all fascinating stories, by the way, and Dr. Schmidt lays them out with crystal clarity. Now, let's bring this whole conversation back to the topic of the historicity of Jesus and data points around the birth of Christianity. So if the TF is substantially authentic, then without any Christian motivation, Josephus confirms at least 7 interesting data points. First, Jesus existed, and he was a teacher who attracted followers. Second, he attracted followers among both Greeks and Jews. Third, he was executed by Pontius Pilate. Fourth, it was Jewish leadership who brought the accusation against Jesus. Fifth, his followers continued on after his death. Sixth, his followers publicly reported that he appeared to them alive after his death. And seventh, he was regarded by Jewish sources as someone who was leading gullible men astray, using this verbiage and using paradoxa, connecting directly to the same characterization in the Talmud and the Toledot Yeshu. Now, this last point is not a Christian claim, it's an antagonistic one, and its presence across multiple independent Jewish sources is historically significant in its own right. Now, I want to focus in on some of the language that Josephus uses when he describes the resurrection. So Josephus records the appearance claim, and Schmidt's restored TF does not have Josephus affirming the resurrection, obviously, but it does have him recording that followers reported seeing Jesus alive, which is also very historically significant. The Greek word that's used by Josephus is this word, which means essentially seemed to be. And Dr. Schmidt actually tracks every instance where Josephus uses this word in the same grammatical construction, and he finds consistently that Josephus means seemed rather than actually appeared. So Dr. Schmidt illustrates this with the story of Joseph's brothers showing Jacob the bloodied coat of Joseph. Josephus uses the same phrase here, where it seemed to Jacob that Joseph was killed by beasts when he actually was not. So Josephus is therefore reporting that Jesus seemed to his followers to be alive, not affirming that he was. He's documenting a belief without endorsing it. Now, this is a non-Christian historian carefully navigating ambiguous language to report the appearance claim without affirming it himself. And that's also a really fascinating historical data point. Now, I want to talk a little bit about skeptical models for the apparent resurrection and the birth of Christianity. Some of those include the RHBS argument by James Fodor and the minimal witnesses argument by Apologetics. So Josephus, writing in the 90s about events in the 50s and 60s, records resurrection claims as a live public assertion within the first generation, and his contacts, Josephus's own historical contacts, were formed within 20 to 30 years of the crucifixion. So combine this with the First Corinthians Creed, which most scholars date to within 2 years of the crucifixion, and the window for legendary inflation becomes very narrow. Scholars of legendary development include A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford University, and he's argued that legend formation typically requires at least 2 full generations to substantially displace historical memory. Dr. Schmidt himself says that the resurrection account wasn't something that developed years or decades or generations later. It's something that happened very soon after the death of Jesus. Now, that doesn't disprove the arguments of some skeptical and atheistic thinkers, but I think it at least creates a bit more tension on the argument that the resurrection itself was a later legendary inflation. Now, I want to say some kind things about the book. So Dr. Schmidt writes with very unusual clarity, and this is a very densely factual work, but Dr. Schmidt lays out the case extremely elegantly in words that are very articulate and still very easy for a member of the lay public to understand. The manuscript detective work in the early chapters is genuinely very enjoyable to follow. Now, I started the script for this video actually intending to write a review of this book, but as I got further on, I felt like just presenting some of the facts that are presented in the book is probably worthwhile. Having said that, I really do recommend that you all check out the book for yourselves. It's a freely available work, and it's a very important text which has been endorsed by a lot of the leading scholars at the top tier institutions. But that's what I think anyways, and really what I want to know more about is what you think. Now, I skipped this at the beginning of the video, but please click the like button, especially if you get something out of this video. Please subscribe to the channel, that really does help us out. Please click the bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss out on future videos. And I'd love to hear your commentary. I do try to respond to each and every comment, so please get at me in the comment section. And this has been a really fascinating thing for me to learn about, so I hope you all check out the book. And one other thing that I hope is that all of you please have a really wonderful day.